The first thing Salar remembered about the Voth was the smell. Something between ozone and old blood, metallic and sweet at once. The kind of smell that settled into your sinuses and didn't leave. He'd been 19 years old the first time they came down through the clouds over Quetta, their dropships silent as falling leaves, and he'd stood in the street with his hands at his sides and watched them land. Not running, not screaming, just watching. His mother had pulled at his arm and he'd gone with her eventually, but he kept turning back, kept looking. He always said that was the moment the Voth made their first miscalculation. They landed in the middle of the day, on a clear sky, in full view of everything. They wanted to be seen. They wanted the fear that came with being seen. But Salar hadn't felt fear. He'd felt something closer to curiosity. And that distinction, that small, stubborn, specifically human gap between terror and interest, was a thing the Voth would spend 20 years failing to understand. The Ghazi program began 4 years after the occupation. It wasn't their idea, exactly. The Voth had a word for it, something that sounded like gravel through a sieve. Roughly translated, the xenobiologists called it functional elevation. The concept was simple enough. You took a species you'd subjugated, one with interesting biological architecture, and you pushed its physiology past its natural ceiling. Enhanced musculature, accelerated neural processing, improved oxygen efficiency. You turned the subjugated population's own bodies into an asset. Better laborers, better soldiers, better instruments. The Voth had done it before, on other worlds. It always worked. The elevated species became dependent on the program that gave them their enhancement, loyal to the Voth by biochemical design, because the compounds that stabilized the elevated biology were controlled at source. You couldn't survive without your handlers. And without survival, there was no rebellion. Salar was 33 when they came to his detention camp, with clipboards made of something that wasn't plastic, and eyes that were reading him from the inside out. He was selected on the spot. He didn't understand why until much later when Dr. Zara Iftikhar, who would become the most important person in his life, who he would also never fully trust, explained it to him in a voice kept deliberately flat. "Your cortisol patterns," she said. "When they entered the camp, everyone else's cortisol spiked. Fight or flight. Yours barely moved. I was afraid. Of course you were. But your system didn't perform it. Something in you decided not to." She looked at her screen, not at him. They found that interesting. He wanted to tell her they were wrong to find it interesting, that it wasn't courage, it was just how he was built. But he suspected she knew that already, and he suspected, too, that it was precisely the point. There were 43 initial subjects. He remembered all their names. After the first year, there were 19. The enhancements weren't always clean. The Voth's biochemistry was extraordinary, but human bodies were, in their words, architecturally inconsistent. What worked on a standard genome worked differently on a stressed one, a malnourished one, a body that had spent 3 years in a detention camp eating reconstituted protein. The trials were not kind. Salar survived them through some combination of biology and will, and he thought sometimes, through sheer bad manners, a refusal to concede that he was supposed to break. He met Zane in the 3rd year. The boy was 22, or close to it. Dark eyes and a jaw set like it had been decided long ago to never open in complaint. He'd come up through a different facility, somewhere north, and they'd transferred him down, when his numbers looked exceptional. He had a habit of standing too close to walls, when he wasn't sure of a room, and a habit of watching senior staff the way a chess player watched the board. Like he was already 3 moves ahead of whatever they were going to do. Salar recognized something in him the way you recognized something in a mirror. Not liking exactly. Recognition. "Your father was Zulfikar," Salar said. The first night, when the barracks were dark enough that talking wasn't performing. A pause. "You knew him, before the occupation. We served together, briefly. He was a better soldier than me." Another pause. "He died in the 1st year. I was 15, I know." Nothing else was said. In the morning, they trained together, and Salar noticed that Zane had inherited his father's footwork. A slight pivot on the back heel, before a forward strike, economical and hard to read. He didn't mention it. Some things you protected by not naming them. The enhancements, when they came in full, were disorienting. Salar's processing speed increased by something the Voth measured in units that meant nothing to him. Subjectively, it felt like the world slowed down by a half second. Like reaction had decoupled from thought, and become something more like instinct but faster and colder. His muscles reknit themselves over a period of weeks in a way that he could feel happening. A deep cellular ache, like growing pains, amplified to an adult scale. His cardiovascular output roughly doubled. He was, by the metrics that mattered to the Voth, a significantly better instrument than he had been. He was also, and this was the thing the Voth had not fully modeled, still entirely himself. The stabilizing compound was called, in Zara's phonetic approximation, something like Catan, the name of the Voth administrator who oversaw the program and who controlled its distribution. A tall creature, physically. The Voth were roughly bipedal, but the proportions were wrong in ways that the human eye registered as deeply uncomfortable. Limbs slightly too long, joints that bent in two directions. A cranium that was almost right but wasn't. Catan had a manner that Zara described as performative restraint, the body language of something that believed it had nothing to fear but enjoyed demonstrating the fact. He moved through the facility like he owned the gravity in the room. The compound came once a week, injected at what the Voth called Nanton intervals. Without it, the enhanced biology would begin to destabilize. Sensory overload first, then motor degradation, then organ failure. The timeline was about 16 days from last injection to lethal threshold. This was, the Voth believed, a complete system of control. You could not escape, because you could not survive escape. You would come back always, because the alternative was a 16-day countdown to your own unraveling. What they had not accounted for was Zara. She was not one of the enhanced. She was something rarer in the Voth's assessment. A technically useful human. A biochemist who understood their systems well enough to contribute to them. They valued her the way they valued a good instrument, which meant they watched her and rewarded her, and did not entirely understand that she was not loyal. She was compliant. She performed compliance very well. But there is a difference, and the Voth, who had successfully domesticated dozens of species, had never encountered a population that held that distinction as consciously as humans did. On the worlds they'd elevated before, compliance and loyalty were the same thing, behaviorally indistinguishable, because the subjugated species didn't have the cognitive architecture to separate them. Humans did. Zara had been synthesizing a partial analog of the stabilizing compound for 2 years before she told Solar. It didn't work as well as the original. The stabilization window was shorter, the effects less clean, but it worked. It meant that a person could go 16 days, then dose with her compound, and extend that window by another 10. Not forever, not comfortable, but enough. She told him in the 3rd year of his enhancement, in the facility's maintenance corridor, where the Voth's ambient surveillance had a blind spot she had mapped out and never used until that moment. She told him because she needed him to tell her if it was worth continuing. She had watched enough of the program's trials by then to know which direction she was betting. He didn't answer immediately. He stood in that corridor for a long moment, and she watched him do the thing she'd noticed him doing before. The stillness, the cortisol not spiking, the brain running somewhere behind the eyes without betraying itself in the face. How long until you can produce enough to supply more than one person? He finally said. She'd expected him to ask if it was safe, or if she was certain. 6 months if I can source what I need. Can you source what you need? I need you to make sure I have continued access to the extraction labs, which means you need to remain an exemplary subject. He almost smiled. I've been a model prisoner for 7 years. Keep being one, he did. And she worked, and the 6 months became 8, and then the compound was there, not enough but more than one. She told Zane next. He listened to everything she said without moving, then asked 2 questions. How certain was she? And who else knew? She told him she was as certain as 7 years of biochemistry made her, and that no one else knew. He nodded once, with a finality that reminded her of a door closing. They did not move immediately. This was the part that the Voth could never have planned against, because it was not rational from the outside. 3 human beings sat on the knowledge that they could leave, and they waited. They watched. They learned. Solar mapped the facility's guard rotations with the unhurried patience of a man who understood that one mistake now meant 16 lives forfeited. Because by the time they moved, the compound supply was enough for 16 people. He waited because the timing had to be right, not because the timing had to be safe. There was no version of this that was safe, but there was a version that was correct, and he was willing to wait for it. Zane trained. Every day, the same brutal schedule, and Salar watched the boy. No. The man, he was past 30 now, refined the enhanced capabilities in ways the Voth observers thought were just exceptional compliance with the program. They weren't. Zane was learning the precise geometry of what he could do. The speed, the force vectors, the sensory range. All of it mapped and remapped until it wasn't training anymore. It was fluency. The Voth had given him a better body. He had turned it into an argument. The night Catan came to conduct his quarterly review of the program's senior subjects. There were 16 enhanced humans who had not received off the Voth compound in 11 days. They were functional. Zara's compound held the degradation at bay, but they felt the edge of it. A heightened sensory edge, a rawness, and Salar had decided after careful thought that this was an advantage. 11 days in, the body was running clean, no Voth chemistry in the system. The enhanced capabilities were entirely theirs. Catan arrived with 6 Voth security personnel and an air of confident tedium that suggested he considered this visit an administrative formality. He stood at the head of the briefing room and read through metrics on his device, while the 16 subjects stood in 2 rows and waited. The smell was there. The ozone bloods that Salar had first registered at 19 in a street in Quetta, and he breathed it and let it mean nothing. What happened next was not a rampage. This was important, and it was the thing that the later Voth tactical analyses would struggle to categorize. It was not chaotic. It was not emotional. It was organized in the way that 20 years of patience organizes things. Completely quietly, without any wasted motion. Zane moved first, because they'd agreed he would, because he was the fastest, and his particular skill was that he didn't look like he was about to move until he already had. He was at the nearest security personnel before the creature completed its first reactive motion. Not a killing blow. Not yet. Not there. A disabling one, precise, learned from years of mapping force vectors against alien physiology on alien bodies. Adjusting for the joint directions that bent wrong by human standards, but had a logic to them once you understood the architecture. The room had been chosen because it had 2 exits and Salar was at one, and Major Dilawar, the quietest of the 16, a man who'd once described his primary talent as not existing until it was useful, was at the other. Catan did not panic. Salar gave him credit for that. The Voth administrator processed the situation with a speed that was genuinely impressive, and reached immediately for the override on the compound distribution network, the kill switch that was supposed to reduce 16 enhanced humans to helpless biochemical chaos. Zara had removed it from his access list 14 days ago, hidden under 3 layers of administrative restructuring that looked like routine maintenance updates. Catan stood with his 2 long fingers on a device that wasn't doing what it was supposed to do, and for the first time in 20 years of program oversight, Salar watched something he hadn't expected. The Voth administrator looked confused, not afraid. Confused. The system had always worked before. The system had worked on 12 worlds. The system was an elegant and complete thing, and it was not working. Salar walked toward him through the controlled noise of the room, through the sound of 16 people doing the precise things they'd spent years preparing to do. And he stopped 2 meters from Catan, and he said, in the Voth's own language, because he'd been listening for 20 years, and Zara had been teaching him for 3. You made us better than you needed. Catan said something, 2 syllables, and Salar's brain produced the translation approximately as impossible or, more precisely, this doesn't happen. I know, Salar said. You've never had a species fight back with the enhancements you gave them. Because you zadished the system so they couldn't survive without you. You built the cage out of their own biology. He paused. We built a door. It wasn't a speech. He said it the way you state a fact to someone who needs to understand what went wrong. Not triumphant. Not angry, just clear. Zane had once, years ago in the barracks, described the way he wanted to be when the moment came. Like explaining the answer to someone who got the math wrong. That was it. That was exactly it. The facility fell in the next 4 hours. 16 enhanced humans moving with 20 years of accumulated purpose through corridors they'd memorized. Against opposition that had never fully stress-tested its assumptions about what the program produced. The Voth's control infrastructure relied on the compound loyalty loop. Without it, their entire response framework was built for a situation that wasn't occurring. They were tactically capable, but strategically wrong. And there is almost nothing more dangerous to a capable force than strategic wrongness. Zara worked the systems from inside. She'd been living for 3 years inside the Voth's administrative network, a ghost in the maintenance logs, and she moved through it now with the particular confidence of someone who has waited a long time to stop being careful. She killed the external communications relay first, which gave them 40 minutes before the regional command would send an inquiry. She opened the detention sectors in sequence, not all at once. All at once created chaos, in sequence created movement, directed and useful. Dilawar, who had indeed spent 20 years not existing until it was useful, turned out to have a talent for the Volth's mechanical systems that none of them had fully appreciated. He had their dropship powered up, and its navigation unlocked in the time it would have taken Solar to find the ignition sequence. When Solar raised an eyebrow at him, Dilawar shrugged with the absolute economy of a man who had simply been waiting for the right question to be asked. In the end, they left with 41 people, not 16. The detention sectors had held civilians. Some of them had been held for years for reasons no one had formally articulated. 41 people in a Voth dropship, lifting through the clouds over what had been a facility and was now just a structure. Solar sat at the front and did not look back. Zane sat beside him and was quiet for a long time. "He'll send more," he said eventually. "He'll send more," Solar agreed. "We took their equipment. We have Zara's compound. We know the facilities." Zane was quiet again. "Then it's not over." "No." "Were you ever afraid it wouldn't work?" Solar looked out through the dropship's viewport at the sky, which was the particular blue that it was over this part of the world in the hours after dawn. A blue that he'd first seen at 19 in a street in Quetta, and that he'd seen in memory through 20 years of detention camp and laboratory and daily maintenance injections and careful watching. The smell of ozone and old blood was gone. The air in the dropship was recycled Voth air that tasted like nothing, and he breathed it and thought about the question. "Every day," he said. "But fear and failure aren't the same thing. You can be afraid of something and still have the door you built." Zane nodded slowly. In the back, Zara was already working. She had a Voth data terminal open across her knees and she was moving through it with the same unreadable focus she'd brought to every task in 20 years. She had the compound synthesis notes, the facility schematics, from 3 other program sites, and the regional command communication logs from the last 6 months. She had been building a door for a long time. She was now measuring how many more needed to be opened. 41 people. A stolen ship. 7 decades of accumulated biochemical intelligence about what the Voth had made of humanity's body, and 20 years of what humanity had made of itself in response. The Voth had come to Quetta, and everywhere else, because they needed instruments. They were thorough, efficient beings who had elevated dozens of species and constructed elegant systems of control that had never failed. They had not built their systems to account for a species that could hold the difference between compliance and loyalty in their heads for 20 years. Wait for the correct moment rather than the safe one. And then, in the end, and with great specificity, explain the answer to someone who got the math wrong. The dropship crossed into free airspace. Somewhere below, the Voth Regional Command was just beginning to notice that something had happened and would continue to not fully understand what, precisely, for a considerable time. Somewhere further back, in a facility that had been designed to produce loyal instruments, every system of control was dark. Solar closed his eyes. He could hear, under the hum of the engines, Zara's fingers on the terminal keys. Steady, unhurried, already working on the next door. The smell of ozone and old blood was gone. Outside the sky was very blue.